The grand estate of Fairbanks Plantation stood as a beacon of wealth, its sprawling grounds dotted with oak trees that had witnessed centuries of Southern history. Behind its towering gates and imposing walls, however, lay a story of deception, obsession, and betrayal. The house was more than just a symbol of wealth. It was the stage upon which the passions of the powerful would be played out in secret, whispered behind closed doors. At the heart of this world was Victoria Fairbanks, a woman whose beauty and charm could captivate even the most stoic of men. The mistress of the plantation, Victoria held power in the house that was unparalleled except, perhaps, for the man who had once owned it all. Her husband, Richard Fairbanks, was a man consumed by jealousy and suspicion. Though he had wealth, status, and an estate to his name, there was one thing he could never control: his wife's heart. Victoria had always been aware of her power over Richard, using it to her advantage as she navigated the complex and often dangerous world of a plantation mistress. The marriage had been one of convenience, sealed with promises of status and luxury, but no love had ever truly existed between them. Richard's jealousy, however, ran deep. He had never been able to tolerate the idea of his wife looking at another man, especially the overseer, Thomas. For years, this unspoken tension between the two had simmered until it reached a boiling point. Victoria had laughed at Richard's suspicions, often mocking him in private, but she had underestimated just how far his jealousy would push him. A moment of recklessness, a bitter flirtation, and a calculated attempt to prove her power over him would soon lead to an unimaginable consequence. A child born from betrayal, whose very existence would unravel everything she had built. In a world where love and jealousy were weapons of war, the birth of a child, darker than the secrets that had created him, would shatter the fragile balance of power that Victoria had so carefully cultivated. And with that birth, the true cost of a life built on lies would begin to reveal itself. Victoria Fairbanks was no stranger to power. She had been raised in the lap of luxury, the daughter of an affluent Southern family, where social standing and appearances were everything. Marrying Richard Fairbanks, a wealthy plantation owner, was the natural next step in her ascent to the pinnacle of Southern society. But while her marriage brought her everything she had been groomed to desire: wealth, respect, and influence, it also brought with it a man whose love was not so easily won. Richard was a man of great pride, whose arrogance was matched only by his paranoia. In the years since their marriage, Victoria had learned to master the art of keeping him satisfied, at least outwardly. She knew how to keep his ego fed, how to make him believe that she was wholly his, despite the cold distance that often separated them in private. But the distance between them wasn't just emotional, it was also physical. Richard's love was stifling, possessive, and obsessive. He expected his wife to remain as flawless as the estate they inhabited, untouched by the world outside. Victoria, however, was no prisoner to such expectations. While Richard was consumed with the upkeep of his plantation, overseeing the endless chores and managing the workforce, Victoria grew restless. The house, with its expensive silks and golden candelabras, had begun to feel like a gilded cage. She found herself wandering the halls late at night, seeking something she couldn't name, a kind of freedom she knew she would never find within the confines of her marriage. That was when Thomas entered the picture, the overseer. Thomas had been with the Fairbanks estate for years, serving as the overseer of the fields. Handsome, strong, and charismatic, he carried a quiet authority that was felt throughout the plantation. He was well liked by the slaves, who respected him for his fair treatment and genuine concern for their well-being, qualities that made him stand apart from the other overseers. It wasn't long before Victoria took notice of him. What began as innocent flirtation soon escalated into something more dangerous, a secret that neither of them could resist. Thomas, aware of the power dynamics at play, was careful not to overstep. But Victoria, ever the mistress of manipulation, found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't expected. She would seek him out in the evenings, when the house was quiet and the sounds of the plantation life faded into the distance. There, in the shadows of the large oak trees that surrounded the estate, they shared whispered conversations and stolen moments, their growing attraction a silent rebellion against the confines of her marriage. Richard, meanwhile, remained blissfully ignorant. His obsession with the estate, the crops, and his finances kept him distracted. He never suspected that his wife, the woman he thought he controlled, was playing a dangerous game with the man who worked beneath him. Victoria's actions, though seemingly harmless in her mind, were a slow burn that would soon ignite the very foundation of her life. She was playing with fire, and soon, the consequences would become impossible to ignore. The tension builds. As the months passed, Richard's paranoia began to grow. He noticed the subtle changes in Victoria's behavior. The way she would smile just a little too brightly when he entered a room. The way she would turn away from him with an odd air of indifference. Her distance was not as subtle as she thought. Her flirtations with Thomas, though kept in the shadows, were starting to take their toll on her marriage. Richard's suspicions about his wife's loyalty began to spiral. The jealousy that had been simmering beneath the surface of their relationship now boiled over into dangerous territory. He began to watch Victoria more closely, scrutinizing her every move, even going so far as to hire a spy to follow her when she left the house. But Victoria, ever the master of manipulation, merely laughed at his accusations in private, finding his jealousy both amusing and predictable. Still, despite her calm exterior, a sense of unease began to settle over her. She realized that Richard's jealousy was becoming more than just a passing irritation. It was turning into a dangerous obsession. But Victoria was no stranger to danger. She thrived in it, relishing the power it gave her over Richard. In fact, she found herself enjoying the growing tension, savoring the idea that she could control him with something as simple as a smile. It was in this atmosphere of rising tension that she found herself one evening, alone with Thomas, on the veranda of the mansion. The night air was warm, and the moon shone brightly over the plantation. They spoke in hushed tones, aware of the risk they were taking, but unable to resist the pull between them. Thomas leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear, and for a moment, Victoria felt a sense of freedom. Freedom from her marriage, freedom from Richard's jealousy, and freedom from the expectations of a society that saw her as nothing more than a possession. But little did she know, this moment of stolen intimacy would set in motion a series of events that would change everything. The beginning of a betrayal. As Victoria sat there, caught between the man she was bound to and the man she had chosen, she was unaware of the storm that was brewing around her. Richard, consumed by jealousy, had begun to piece together the truth. He had his suspicions, and his instincts were sharper than Victoria had given him credit for. The next morning, as Victoria entered the mansion for breakfast, she saw that Thomas was gone, his belongings no longer in the small quarters he had occupied. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Richard had found out. But what Richard didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the consequences of their actions would soon reveal themselves in the most unexpected way, a way that would forever change their lives and the future of their plantation. The tension in the Fairbanks mansion was palpable. Victoria had never seen her husband like this before. The usually controlled and methodical Richard had descended into a frenzy. His jealousy, once simmering under the surface, now boiled over with a fury that neither of them had anticipated. The beginning of Richard's obsession. Richard had always been possessive of his wife, but over the past few months, it had escalated into something darker. His suspicions about Victoria's relationship with Thomas had been confirmed in his mind, and now he was determined to confront it head-on. The whispers in the mansion, the rumors he'd overheard in town, and the subtle hints from his spies, everything pointed to the same thing. Victoria had betrayed him. The trust that once existed between them had eroded to nothing. Richard no longer saw his wife as the woman he had married, the woman who had once captivated him with her beauty and charm. Instead, she had become a symbol of everything that was wrong in his world, a symbol of betrayal. He waited for the perfect moment to confront her. Victoria's growing anxiety. Victoria, though often calm and composed, began to sense the shift in the air. There were no outward signs, but she could feel it in the way Richard watched her now. His once loving gaze had turned cold, his smile forced and tight. The tension was thick, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. She had seen the way Richard's jealousy had been growing, the way his behavior had become erratic, but she had underestimated just how far it would go. She had thought that by playing the game by keeping Richard under her control, she could keep the balance. But now, It seemed that the scales had tipped, and the consequences of her actions were inevitable. It was the night after Thomas's disappearance that everything came to a head. The confrontation. Victoria had just finished her evening routine when she heard the heavy footsteps of Richard approaching. Her pulse quickened, her stomach tightening with dread. She knew what was coming. Richard was no longer willing to sit idly by while she played her dangerous game. The facade of their marriage was crumbling, and with it, her sense of security. Richard entered the room without knocking, his face twisted in anger. His eyes were wide, feverish with the suspicion and jealousy that had consumed him. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, staring at her with a mix of disbelief and fury. For a moment, Victoria said nothing. She stood her ground, her heart pounding but her face betraying nothing. She was the mistress of her domain, and no matter how much Richard's rage threatened to break through, she was determined not to show weakness. "Where is he?" Richard finally spat, his voice low but filled with venom. "Where is Thomas? Where has he gone?" Victoria's heart skipped a beat. The truth was right there in front of her, hanging in the air between them. She had no choice but to admit what was happening, what had happened, but she wasn't ready to face the wrath that would come with it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "Thomas left for personal matters. It's none of your concern." Richard took a step forward, his anger barely contained. "None of my concern? You think I'm a fool? You think I don't see what's happening? I've been watching you, Victoria, watching you both. You think I didn't notice? The way you look at him, the way you speak to him. You think I don't know?" Victoria felt a cold chill settle over her. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every wall seemed to close in around her as Richard's rage threatened to consume them both. "I told you, it's nothing," she said, her voice becoming more forceful, trying to maintain control. "I've done nothing wrong." Richard's eyes flared with fury. "You think I don't see the lies in your eyes? You think I don't know? You've betrayed me, Victoria, and now you'll have to face the consequences." Before she could react, Richard seized her by the arm, his grip tight and painful. He yanked her forward, pulling her toward the grand staircase. "I've let you have your fun, but no more," he hissed through clenched teeth. "You will pay for this." The fallout. Richard's grip on her arm was unrelenting as he dragged her through the mansion. The house, which had once been a symbol of their shared power, now felt like a cold, oppressive maze. Victoria could hear the sounds of the other servants and slaves murmuring in the halls, unsure of what was happening, but too afraid to interfere. The panic rose in her chest as she realized that Richard was no longer interested in talking. He was beyond reasoning, consumed by jealousy and rage. The consequences of their actions were no longer just a matter of their marriage, it was a matter of life and death. They reached the dining room, where Richard threw open the door and threw her inside. Victoria stumbled, barely catching herself on the edge of the table. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she stared at him, fear rising in her chest. "You think you can make a fool of me, Victoria?" Richard's voice was low and dangerous, and the venom in it sent a shiver down her spine. "You think you can play with my heart and my trust and walk away unscathed?" Victoria straightened herself, fighting to control the fear that threatened to break through. She had never seen Richard like this. He was a man undone by his jealousy, and that made him more dangerous than any enemy she had ever faced. "You've gone mad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Richard replied, his tone deadly calm. "I've been patient. I've let you live your little game. But no more. Tonight, you'll pay for your betrayal." He moved toward her, and Victoria instinctively backed away. She was trapped nowhere to run. The door behind her was closed, the windows barred. There was no escape. But as he advanced, something in Victoria shifted. Her years of manipulation, her years of control, her ability to twist the world around her, were no longer enough. Richard had pushed her too far, and for the first time in her life, she saw the man she had married for what he truly was. A tyrant, ruled by his jealousy and insecurities. The child of midnight. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, and with every step, she realized just how far gone Richard truly was. His jealousy, once a quirk she had laughed at, was now a force she could no longer control. "You can't do this," she said, voice rising in desperation. "You'll regret it." Richard paused, a look of cold fury crossing his face. "I already regret letting you do this to me." He reached out and grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to face him. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she realized the terrible truth. She had gone too far. Her betrayal had brought her to this moment, and now there was no way out. Suddenly, she felt something in her, something she had kept hidden, even from herself. Fear, yes, but also something else, a sense of inevitability. The seeds of her downfall had been sown long ago, and now they were about to blossom into a storm she could no longer control. "You'll never escape this," Richard spat, just as Victoria's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The baby she had carried, her child, was the final link in the chain of destruction. She had thought she could control the game, could bend Richard to her will. But the baby's skin color, dark as midnight, had sealed her fate. The silent betrayal. As Victoria's world began to crumble, she realized that the choices she had made, the lies, the manipulations, had led her to this moment. The child she had hoped would be a secret, a symbol of her rebellion, was now the one thing she could never undo. The color of the baby's skin would expose the truth, and no amount of manipulation could save her now. The following days felt like an eternity. The house, once filled with the hum of activity and laughter, was now drowned in an eerie silence. The faintest creaks of floorboards echoed throughout the halls as Victoria walked. Her every step weighed down by the heavy burden of her own choices. The once proud Fairbanks plantation now felt like a tomb, the walls closing in with each passing moment. Richard had barely spoken to her since the confrontation in the dining room. His rage had subsided into a cold, simmering silence. But his eyes, always so sharp, now held a deeper, more dangerous intent. Every time he looked at her, she could feel the accusation in his gaze, and it made her skin crawl. He knew. There was no denying it anymore. The child she had borne, the child whose midnight skin betrayed the truth, was now the symbol of her greatest betrayal, and there was no way to escape the consequences. The questions begin. It was late one night when Richard finally spoke to her again. The plantation house was still, the servants asleep, and the faint light of the full moon filtered through the curtains. Victoria was alone in the parlor, staring into the fire, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. But she knew that no matter how far she ran, the consequences of her actions would follow her. "Victoria." Richard's voice broke through the silence, sharp and cold. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the dim light. "We need to talk." Victoria didn't look up at first, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. She had tried to ignore the growing distance between them, to pretend that the storm brewing inside her was just a passing phase. But now, the truth was undeniable. And Richard was here, demanding answers. "I don't think there's much left to say," she replied, her voice flat, devoid of the usual fire she used to hide behind. She knew what he wanted, but she wasn't sure she could face it. Richard took a step forward, his boots clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "You've made a fool of me," he said, his voice tight with fury. "Do you think I don't know what's been going on? The child, my child, isn't even mine, is it?" The words struck her like a slap to the face. She had been prepared for this moment, had steeled herself for the rage, the accusations. But hearing him say it out loud felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "It's yours, Richard," she said quietly, the lie slipping from her lips like a second skin. "You know it is." But Richard wasn't fooled. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "I've seen it with my own eyes, Victoria," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You can't hide it anymore. That child, Isaiah, is the color of midnight. And you think I don't know where he came from? You think I can't see the truth?" Victoria's breath hitched in her throat. She stood up abruptly, her hands trembling at her sides. "I didn't." "You didn't?" Richard interrupted, his voice rising in anger. "You think I'm blind? You think I don't know what Thomas has been to you? You think I didn't see the way you looked at him?" Victoria's mind raced. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, as the walls around her seemed to close in. The secrets she had tried to keep buried for so long were now flooding to the surface. and she had no choice but to face them. She had thought she could control everything, the game, the lies, the men in her life. But now, everything was slipping through her fingers. The exposé. Richard's eyes gleamed with a mix of fury and satisfaction. "I should have known from the start," he spat, his voice seething with rage. "You think you're clever, don't you, Victoria? You think you can play me for a fool, but I've been watching you all along." He paused, his gaze turning cold. "You've been using Thomas, haven't you? You've been using him to get what you want. And now, you've used him to make a mockery of me. I thought we had an understanding, but you've crossed the line, and now I have to deal with the consequences." Victoria's chest tightened. "Richard, please," she started, but he raised his hand to silence her. "No, you don't get to say anything more." His voice was low but full of venom. "The truth is clear now. I was a fool to trust you, and now I'm going to make sure that everyone knows it. You're nothing but a whore who used me to get what you wanted." Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. She had been living in a house built on secrets, manipulating everyone around her to maintain control. But the house of lies was crumbling, and now she had no way of stopping the destruction. The truth, ugly and undeniable, was coming for her. "I don't want to hear your excuses," Richard said, his voice cold. "You will leave this house. You and that child are no longer welcome here." Victoria felt a cold shiver run through her as she realized what he was saying. The house, the life she had built, was slipping away. She had thought she could control everything, but now Richard was taking it all from her. "Where will I go?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Leave," Richard spat. "You're not my wife anymore. You're not even a mistress. You're nothing, and I'll make sure the rest of the world knows it." The fallout. Richard's decision was final. The next few days were a blur for Victoria. She had been cast out of the house, her reputation tarnished, her power stripped away. The grand estate that had once been her domain now felt like a foreign land. She was no longer the queen of the mansion, no longer the woman who controlled the fates of the slaves and the staff. She was just a woman with a child whose very existence would forever mark her as a betrayer. Word of the scandal spread like wildfire across the plantation. The slaves whispered among themselves, exchanging rumors about the birth of Isaiah. Richard's fury, his jealousy, and his decision to cast Victoria aside became the talk of the estate. Thomas, though no longer part of the household, became a ghost in the whispers of the slaves, a figure who had been used and discarded as well. As for Victoria, her future was uncertain. The one thing she had held onto, the power to manipulate those around her, was gone. And now, she faced the consequences of her actions, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. But there was one thing that Victoria hadn't anticipated. The baby, Isaiah, was not just a symbol of her betrayal. He was a living, breathing reminder of the very thing she had tried to control, the love and passion she had fought so hard to suppress. And in the darkest corners of her heart, as she stared down at Isaiah's midnight skin, she couldn't help but wonder if, in the end, he was the one who would have the power to destroy her, not her husband, not the plantation, but the child she had never truly wanted, yet had given birth to anyway. Victoria stood in the doorway of her former home, her fingers resting on the ornate frame. The mansion she had once ruled now seemed like a prison, its grandeur only serving to remind her of what she had lost. Behind her, the vast estate stretched out into the horizon, but all she saw was emptiness, the void left by the collapse of her power and the unraveling of her carefully constructed world. Richard's decision to cast her out was swift and final. He had made his intentions clear, and the servants, slaves, and even the overseers who had once deferred to her now turned their backs without a second thought. For the first time in years, Victoria felt what it was like to be invisible. She had built her life on manipulation, control, and deceit. But now those very tools had turned against her. And as she looked down at Isaiah, his midnight black skin, a reminder of the truth she could never undo, she felt a cold sense of finality. There was no going back from this. The walls of her former life had come crashing down around her, and she was left to face the bitter aftermath of her choices. The fallout at the plantation. The weeks following her exile were filled with humiliation. Victoria's departure from the mansion had been met with whispers and stares. Richard, no longer burdened by the need to maintain appearances, spread word of her betrayal throughout the estate, ensuring that no one would ever again trust her or see her as the woman of power she had once been. The slaves, who had once been under her control, now saw her as a symbol of failure, a cautionary tale. They had long known the cruelty of the masters, but now, with Victoria's fall from grace, they understood just how fragile the system of control could be. For some, her demise was a bittersweet victory, a reminder that even those who thought themselves untouchable could be brought low. Isaiah, the child who had once been the secret to her power, was now the one thing she could never hide. His skin, darker than the expectations of the world around them, was the final blow to her carefully constructed life. As Victoria carried him in her arms, she could feel the weight of his existence pressing down on her, and she knew that there would be no escaping the shame, the struggle for survival. Victoria's days were spent wandering from place to place, searching for any semblance of shelter. She had no home, no security, and no allies. Her relationship with her family had been severed long ago, and even the few friends she once had turned their backs on her when the scandal broke. The only place she could go was the outskirts of town, where the poor and the discarded lived. A shabby, nondescript house on the edge of the village became her refuge, but it was far from the life of luxury she had once known. The house, small and run down, was a far cry from the grand estate she had occupied for so many years, but it was all she had left. Victoria tried to make a life for herself there, but the weight of her past decisions loomed large. The whispers never stopped. The townspeople, many of whom had once respected her position as mistress of the estate, now saw her as nothing more than a fallen woman, a woman who had lost everything in pursuit of her own desires. In the quiet moments, when she was alone with Isaiah, she often wondered if this was the life she had truly wanted. Was this the price of her actions? To live in exile, separated from everything she had once held dear, with only a child who could never be the future she had envisioned. The questions haunted her, and though she tried to bury them, they would not go away. Thomas's return. It was during this time of isolation that Thomas returned to the picture. The overseer, once the object of Victoria's affections, had left the plantation when the revolt erupted, disappearing into the shadows. But now, months later, he resurfaced, seeking out Victoria in the village. Their reunion was a strange one. Thomas, like her, had fallen from the position he once held. The once immovable overseer was now just another man struggling to survive in a world that no longer cared for him. He had no place in the new world, just as Victoria had no place in her own. "I heard what happened," Thomas said quietly as he sat across from her in the small house she now called home. His voice held the weight of shared history, of things they had both lost. Victoria didn't know how to respond. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing that Thomas would eventually come looking for her. She had once thought of him as a partner in crime, a man with whom she could share her deepest desires and ambitions. But now, their bond seemed thin and fragile, stretched too thin by the consequences of their actions. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it finally done?" Thomas nodded. "There's no going back. Richard's reputation has been destroyed, and the estate is in ruins. You've lost your position, your wealth, and your name. I've lost everything too." Victoria looked down at Isaiah, who was asleep in her arms. "And what about him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happens to him?" Thomas looked at the child, his expression unreadable. "He's your son. He has no future in this world. Not with the way things are now." Victoria felt her heart tighten. It was the truth she had been avoiding, the truth she had tried to deny. Her son, the child born of her betrayal, would never be accepted by the world. He would never be allowed to live freely, not with the stain of her actions hanging over him. A final decision. Victoria spent the following days in a daze, caught between the remnants of her old life and the harsh reality that awaited her. She knew she could not go back to Richard, not after everything that had happened. And she knew she could not stay in the village forever, living as an outcast. She needed to make a choice, and for the first time since the day Isaiah was born, Victoria thought of the future. The future of her son, of her life, and of the world she had tried so hard to control. It was time for her to leave, to disappear. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do. But one thing was clear. She could not stay in the ruins of her past. The choices she had made, the betrayal, the lies, had led her here, but they didn't have to define the rest of her life. And so, one fateful night, Victoria gathered what little she had and, with Isaiah in her arms, left the village behind. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to forge a new path, one where her son, and perhaps even she herself, could finally be free of the ghosts that haunted them. Victoria had made the decision. In the dead of night, with only the faint glow of the moon to guide her steps, she and her son, Isaiah, left the small, dilapidated house in the village. The night air was thick with humidity, but it felt different, more oppressive, more suffocating. She was running, but running to where? The question lingered in her mind as she moved quickly through the darkened streets, her hands clutching Isaiah close to her chest. Her life, the life she had once known as a plantation mistress, was gone. The wealth, the power, the safety of being surrounded by walls and servants, all of it had evaporated in the wake of her own betrayal. And yet, in that silence, in the emptiness of what she had left behind, Victoria realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she was free. Or at least, that's what she told herself. But freedom was not the same as peace. The harsh reality of exile. Victoria's journey was not one of comfort. As she and Isaiah walked through the narrow dirt roads that wound their way out of town, she realized that the life she had once lived, one of luxury and ease, had left her ill-prepared for the harshness of exile. There were no grand meals to feast upon, no silks to wear. There was only the constant ache of her body from the days of walking, the hunger that gnawed at her belly, and the overwhelming fear that accompanied every footstep. But what hurt the most was the guilt. Every moment she spent away from Richard, away from the life she had once controlled, was a constant reminder of the decisions she had made. Isaiah, though innocent in all of this, was now bound to her fate. His skin, dark as midnight, was a permanent reminder of her betrayal of the affair she had kept hidden, and of the man who would never claim him as his own. As they walked, Victoria looked at Isaiah, her heart breaking for him. He was a child, yet already marked by the world's cruelty. In her arms he slept soundly, unaware of the storm she had unleashed by giving birth to him. Her beautiful, dark-skinned child, the one she had hoped would be a secret, a weapon to gain control, was now the very symbol of her downfall. She kissed his forehead gently, her hand trembling as she brushed a lock of his hair away. "I'll make it right, my son," she whispered softly, though the words felt hollow. How could she make it right? Was there any redemption for the things she had done? Finding shelter. The first few nights were the hardest. Victoria and Isaiah found refuge in abandoned buildings and barns, any place that offered shelter from the night air. The world outside was harsh, and every step she took felt like she was walking into an abyss of uncertainty and fear. She had no plan, no destination, only a vague idea that she needed to get far from the plantation, far from Richard's wrath, and far from the life she had once known. But survival was not easy. Without the luxuries she had once taken for granted, Victoria found herself reliant on the kindness of strangers. A few people, poor farmers who had heard the whispers about the collapse of the Fairbanks plantation, gave her food and a place to sleep for a night or two. But kindness was rare. Most people were distrustful, wary of a woman like her, a woman who had once been rich, powerful, and above all, untouchable. In the eyes of these strangers, she was just another outcast, a woman on the run, with a child who bore the mark of scandal. The return of Thomas. Days turned into weeks, and as the weather grew colder, Victoria's resolve began to weaken. She had fled the life she knew, but now, with no home and no allies, she was realizing how truly alone she was. Isaiah, growing older and more aware of his surroundings, became her sole focus, the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. But even her fierce love for him could not mask the crushing weight of guilt that continued to plague her. It was during this time that Thomas returned. Victoria had almost forgotten about him but not quite. The overseer's absence had allowed her to briefly put him out of her mind. But now, he was here, standing in front of her with a look of concern on his face. "Victoria," he said softly, his voice familiar, but with an edge of caution. "I couldn't leave things like this. You shouldn't be out here alone." Thomas had always been a figure in Victoria's life, someone who had shared her desires and ambitions. She had once seen him as a partner in her rebellion, a man who had stood beside her in the most private of moments. But now, seeing him again, something felt different. Perhaps it was the passage of time. Perhaps it was the consequences of what they had done together. But Thomas no longer seemed like a man who could offer her any kind of salvation. He was as lost as she was. "I didn't ask for your help, Thomas," Victoria said, her voice cold, a defensive barrier rising up to shield her from him. "You made your choice, and I made mine. Now we're both stuck with the consequences." Thomas looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I never meant for things to turn out like this, Victoria. I thought we were playing a game, but it's gone too far. I came back to help you. We can leave, together. There's still a way out." Victoria shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand. It's over. There's no going back from what we've done. I can't undo the damage I've caused, and neither can you." Thomas took a step closer, his voice softening. "Maybe, but you can still have a life, Victoria. You and Isaiah. You don't have to live like this." For the first time in weeks, Victoria's resolve faltered. She had been so sure of herself, sure that her decisions were the right ones, sure that leaving Richard and the plantation behind would lead to something better. But now, standing in front of Thomas, she wasn't so sure anymore. Could she start over? Could she rebuild her life? "No," she whispered. "No, I can't. The dangers of the past." As the days passed, the reality of Victoria's situation became clearer. The past would never let her go. No matter how far she ran, the consequences of her choices would follow her like a shadow. It was not just Richard who would seek her out. There were others, wealthy landowners, people with connections, people who had once been her friends who would not let her betray them, go unpunished. They would hunt her down, just as they had done to others who dared to challenge the status quo. And so, Victoria faced the harshest reality of all. No matter how much she wanted to escape the life she had built, she could never truly outrun the consequences of her actions. As night fell over the quiet farm where she had found shelter, Victoria held Isaiah close, her heart heavy with regret. The road to redemption was long, and she had barely begun the journey. The days dragged on like an endless horizon, each one blending into the next as Victoria fought to keep her life together. The quiet farm where she and Isaiah had taken refuge now felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. While she had escaped the immediate wrath of Richard and the gossip of the estate, the harsh reality of her new life without the comforts she had once known was beginning to sink in. The house, small and tucked away, was far from the mansion she had ruled. There were no fine meals, no servants at her beck and call, and no lavish balls to attend. Her world had shrunk, and she had only the land, the dwindling supplies she had left, and the distant memory of a life she could no longer return to. Yet it wasn't the isolation that wore at her spirit, it was the constant, gnawing question that lingered in her mind. Was it too late for her to change? Could she ever find peace in the life she had chosen for herself and her son, or was she doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, no matter where she went? The return of the past. The answer came sooner than she had anticipated. One crisp morning, as she fed Isaiah in the kitchen, a knock on the door interrupted her solitude. She froze, her heart pounding. The rhythm of the day, which had felt almost comforting in its repetition, was now shattered by the sound of the knock. She looked down at Isaiah, his wide eyes staring up at her in innocent confusion. He had no idea what the world outside had in store for him. He was just a child, born into a world of betrayal and consequence, carrying the weight of his mother's mistakes on his tiny shoulders. Victoria placed him gently on the floor, watching him crawl around as she approached the door cautiously. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, the air heavy with tension. When she opened it, she was greeted by a familiar face, the face she had thought she would never see again. It was Thomas, her breath caught in her throat. He stood before her, his expression guarded, his clothes weathered from travel. The sight of him brought back memories of the plantation, of the secret moments they had shared, of the betrayal that had destroyed everything. "You've been hiding," Thomas said softly, his voice a mix of regret and resolve. "I couldn't let you stay like this, Victoria. You can't keep running forever." Victoria stood motionless, her mind racing. She had hoped to leave everything behind, to escape the life she had led with Richard and Thomas. But now, with Thomas standing in front of her, the past had come rushing back, like a flood she couldn't control. "I'm not running," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm just living." "You don't have to live like this," Thomas said, his eyes pleading with her. "You and Isaiah deserve more than this life. We can fix it, Victoria. We can make it right." Victoria stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard those words before, the promises of change, the hope that she could escape the life that had bound her. But she had also learned the hard truth. Promises were empty. Action spoke louder than words, and every step she had taken to escape had led her back to the same place, the same cycle of lies, betrayal, and broken promises. "I've already lost everything," she whispered. "Everything I ever wanted. Everything I built, it's gone. And now all I have is Isaiah." Thomas took a step forward, his hand outstretched as if to comfort her, but Victoria pulled away, her eyes hardening. "I can't go back, Thomas. I can't undo the past, and I can't let you be a part of it anymore." The cost of redemption. The words hung between them like a heavy curtain, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The truth of what Victoria had just said settled into the silence. She had tried to rebuild, to outrun her past, but the truth was that there was no escaping it. The world she had left behind, her wealth, her status, the power she had once wielded, was gone, and in its place was a life defined by the choices she had made. Thomas stood there, staring at her, his face etched with the same guilt and regret that had been gnawing at her for months. He had played a part in all of this, just as much as she had. They had both betrayed Richard, both betrayed the trust they had been given. And now, they were both paying the price. "I came to take you away," Thomas said quietly, his voice filled with sadness. "But you don't want that. You don't want me." Victoria felt a pang in her chest. She had once loved him, or at least, had believed she did. But now, she wasn't sure what was left. What was love, after all, if it only led to destruction? If it had cost her everything? "I've been running my whole life," she said, her voice steady now. "Running from what I did, running from the mistakes I made. I can't keep doing it. I can't keep running." "It is once so, King." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression resigned. "Then, what will you do?" Victoria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and defiance. "I'm done trying to fix things. I've destroyed too much. All I can do now is protect Isaiah." A final decision. The evening fell silent as Thomas left, his figure disappearing into the night, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts. The weight of his departure settled heavily on her chest. He was right in one way: she couldn't keep running. But that didn't mean she had to return to the life she had once known. The past was gone, and there was no turning back. The only thing she could control now was her future, and that meant making a choice for Isaiah, for the child who had been caught in the crossfire of her mistakes. Victoria stared out the window into the darkening sky. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing. No matter how broken she was, no matter how much the past haunted her, she had to create a future for Isaiah. He deserved that. She couldn't undo the past, but she could protect him from it. She could raise him in a world where the mistakes of her past didn't define his future. The beginning of a new life. The decision came in the quiet of that night, when the world seemed still, and the weight of everything Victoria had lost pressed heavily on her shoulders. She would leave this life behind, leave the ghosts of her past, and create something new. It wouldn't be easy. There would be hardships, challenges, and moments when the temptation to fall back into the life she had known would be overwhelming. But she was determined. For the first time in years, Victoria felt something stir inside her, a glimmer of hope. She would not let her past destroy the future she could still create. She would protect Isaiah, raise him in a world that was free of the corruption and cruelty she had once embraced. And so, as the night stretched on, Victoria made her decision. The past was gone, and all she had left was the future. She didn't know what it would look like, or how she would get there, but she knew one thing for certain. She would fight for it. With Isaiah asleep beside her, she looked out into the distance, the moonlight reflecting off the trees in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled.